How did how Solomon dealt with two mothers exhibit his wisdom? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse by verse study of the book of 1 Kings on walking through the Bible.
Word the glory of his cross.
Today we're going to be discussing 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 16 to 28. Before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 16. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry, just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, 1 Kings chapter 3, beginning at verse 16. Now 2 women who were harlots came to the king and stood before him. And one woman said, "O my lord, this woman and I dwell in the same house, and I gave birth while she was in the house. Then it happened the 3rd day after I had given birth, that this woman also gave birth, and we were together. No one was with us in the house, except the 2 of us in the house. And this woman's son died in the night, because she lay on him. So she arose in the middle of the night, and took my son from my side, while your maidservant slept, and laid him in her bosom, and laid her dead child in my bosom. And when I rose in the morning to nurse my son, there he was dead. But when I examined him in the morning, indeed, he was not my son, whom I had borne. Then the other woman said, No, but the living one is my son, and the dead one is your son. And the first woman said, No, but the dead one is your son, and the living one is my son. Thus they spoke before the king. And the king said, The one who says, This is my son who lives, and your son is the dead one, and the other one says, No, but your son is the dead one, and my son is the living one. Then the king said, Bring me a sword. So they brought a sword before the king. And the king said, Divide the living child in 2, and give half to one and half to the other. Then the woman whose son was living spoke to the king, for she yearned with compassion for her son. And she said, O my lord, give her the living child, and by no means kill him. But the other said, Let him be neither mine nor yours, but divide him. So the king answered and said, Give the first woman the living child, and by no means kill him. She is his mother. And all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had rendered, and they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice. In our last lesson, we had God appearing to Solomon in a dream and telling him to ask for whatever he wanted, and it would be given him. Instead of asking for wealth, the destruction of his enemies, or a long life, Solomon asked for wisdom in order to correctly judge God's people. Solomon showed his humility in asking God for this, but he also saw what had happened to his father, who did not always show wisdom in executing justice, and so perhaps wanted to avoid what happened to his father in that regard. God gave Solomon wisdom, but he also gave him peace and riches, and if Solomon continued to obey the Lord, God would extend Solomon's life too. Coming to verse 16, we get the first exhibition of this new wisdom with a rather peculiar case. In it we have 2 women, harlots, who had given birth to children 3 days apart. These 2 women lived in the same house, and as harlots had no husbands. Then one night the second woman accidentally killed her child by laying on him. But instead of mourning over this, she simply switched the children while the others slept, leaving her with the dead child. When it was discovered by the first woman the next day, a disagreement broke out. Now it is highly likely that these women went before the local courts, but the judges couldn't decide the case due to there actually not being any evidence that could decide this case one way or another. All they had was the testimony of each woman saying the living child was in fact their child. There were no DNA tests, no neighbors who could attest to which child belonged to which woman. And of course, the child couldn't speak either. So the case would be sent to Solomon for adjudication. But what was Solomon to do? It was a classic case of she said scenario. But that's where Solomon's wisdom came in. He had to find out who the child's real mother was, without either of the 2 women knowing what he was doing. So he devised a test about who really loved the child more, for that would be the real mother. And so Solomon asked for the child to be brought, and then, because both laid claim to the child, he would cut the child in half and give half to each of them. Of course, on its face, this seemed downright foolish, for in cutting the child in half, the second child would die too. How could this possibly be a solution? And that's the point. The true mother would have such an affection for the child that she wouldn't want to see her child die. She would relinquish her parental rights before she would allow that to happen. The false mother wouldn't care, for if she couldn't have the child, why would she want the real mother to have the child either? The first woman proved to be the one who loved the child and asked for its salvation, while the second one agreed to have the child sawn in two. Solomon therefore knew the first woman was the mother and granted the child to the first woman. This solution was not easy, because in the beginning both women were adamant this was their child. But when push came to shove, the truth was deduced. But it was only deduced through the use of wisdom, and in Solomon's case, the wisdom God provided. Remember, Solomon is a young man. By all accounts, Solomon didn't have children yet, and he still had the inexperience of youth. So while a solution like this might come to an older man, it is unlikely to be seen by a younger man. That is, unless God granted this young man wisdom, as is the case with Solomon. This display of wisdom by Solomon didn't go unnoticed by the people either, for they feared Solomon, knowing that the wisdom he had must be from God, and that therefore someone couldn't simply stand before the king and lie, for God would point that lie out through the judgments of Solomon. We'll continue seeing the early administration of Solomon's kingdom, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of 1 Kings chapter 4, verses 1 to 19, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time.
Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.